Welcome back to another episode of BJCP Beer Reviews with Leo. Today, I would like to help clarify the difference between two very similar styles, porters and stouts. Most of us have probably come across these at a bar and thought, I'm not really sure what the difference is. How do I know what I want? Well, there's actually a good reason for that. It turns out they are in fact very similar styles with families of substyles that share almost all the characteristics that we use to differentiate beers. Now, historically speaking, stout was the stronger of the two beers, and that was the only thing that reliably differentiated the stout from the porter. A stout was in fact called a stout porter, and you could also order a stout pale ale, which was a stronger version of pale ale. So again, stout historically at least meant higher in alcohol, probably also higher in price, but not sure about that, to be honest. And in the modern era, the alcohol of each of these categories is actually quite similar and overlapping. It ranges from about 4 to, well, usually under 10, but in the case of some of the imperial stouts, especially these crazy bourbon barrel aged and pumpkin this and worldwide stout and all these other things, you can get well into the double digit percentages, up to 18%. Although I don't know if I've seen porters. I don't know if I've seen anything over like 15 called a porter. And that's probably appropriate, honestly. And of course, this kind of depends on the substyle. But among the vital statistics given, only IBUs is noticeably different. Alcohol, SRM, so the color, they all largely overlap between stouts and porters. The one thing, though, is the IBUs, with porters ranging from 25 to 50 IBUs compared to stouts with more intense 35 to 75. So that's going to be your first thing to look for when you're picking up a brown black beer and you're like, what is this? You can smell it, you can taste it. If it is significantly more bitter than average, or if you get your first impression is that it's quite bitter, it's probably going to be a stout. Now, in addition, there are two other distinctions that, broadly speaking, seem to help us best differentiate stouts from porters, and that would be the roast intensity and the roast acidity. Just acidity. Now, porters generally should have a low roast intensity. That's not to say that roast won't be present, it's just that it won't be at the forefront. And in comparison, stouts favor this kind of roastiness instead of sort of more complex and flavorful dark malt character and that you would expect for a porter. So roast character for porters should be coming across more smoothly, like in the Founder's Porter that I just did a review for. Maybe it could also be described as moderate, but in general it should be somewhat smooth or restrained. And in almost all cases, the roast character of porters should be considered optional, and definitely not like overly pronounced. So in general, then, porters are going to be less strong and assertive than stouts. And in contrast to porters, stouts are going to be explicitly characterized by the higher intensity of roast character. Also, the bitterness and hoppiness, especially in the case of American stouts. In general, American beers are going to be more bitter than their English counterparts. That's sort of another video, maybe, but yeah, if you're looking at American craft beer, you can expect bigger usually and more bitter, more hoppy usually also. So in that sense, then, when you're trying to think about these styles, I would say American stouts are most similar maybe to like a black IPA, but black IPAs are going to have the hops really at the forefront, and they're going to be absent of the roast character and the greater body that you would have in a stout. So a stout's going to have body and bitterness, um, and especially that roast character, whereas a porter will maybe have the body, but definitely not as much roast character and probably less bitterness also. Um, and then even among sweeter stouts, like your tropical, your milk, your sweet stouts, the roast character is still going to be present and notable. And I think among porters, the roast can be absent entirely. You can have like a, I don't know, like a hazelnut brown porter. For me, a porter is much more like a richer, darker malt kind of character brown ale, and that darker, richer character can also end up being higher alcohol, but and then darker color as well. Excuse me. A final character that is, I think, probably somewhat rare, but this can also help us differentiate stouts from porters, is acidity. Now, historically, stouts would sometimes include an acidic note, and so again, like when you're thinking about this, for me, when I hear acidic and roasty, to me that comes like the first thing that jumps in my head is like black coffee. So I'm gonna go through a couple of different rules of thumb or heuristics in terms of what I think of when I think of these styles, and that's gonna be one of them. Um, Now, as a brewer, maybe you're interested in the ingredients, and from an ingredient perspective, I would say if you want to reflect that greater roast character in a stout, you're probably going to expect the presence of more highly kiln malts. That's like 400 plus Lovabond, and that usually, but not always, includes roasted barley. Some people think that if you want to have a stout, it's gotta have roasted barley. No, not really. I mean, sure, maybe, but you can definitely have roasted barley in a porter as well. Um, and if you want to make a porter with less roast, what you might do then is increase your kind of crystal, caramel, toffee type flavors. And you might do this by adding or favoring a higher Lovabond crystal malt, so like a crystal 60 or a crystal 80 rather than your crystal 40. I would also expect the presence of chocolate malt to give that darker character, but less of a coffee-like impression. And so then here are the sort of heuristics that I've got for ease of differentiation. Let's initially take for granted that you have a dark ale, say 5 to 8%, and you're like, what is this? Well, when you take that first sip, the presence or absence of roasted barley is not going to be enough. I don't even know that you could tell that there's roasted barley in a beer just by trying it, unless your palate's highly trained. Generally speaking, then, the styles are going to be quite similar. As I had said, the usual statistics are not going to help you enough if they're both listed and the bitterness is relatively high. That could be one decent indicator that it could be a stout, especially if the hop character is prominent. So that's one. If the beer strikes you as obviously or intensely roasty, again, I would probably call that a stout. If it comes across as richly dark but is lacking in roast intensity, so think maybe of flavors like raisin, prune, cocoa, that I would say is more of a porter. If it has that acidic note, maybe a little tart or sour, that's leaning more towards a stout. And then this is maybe my number one go-to heuristic. If your first impression of the flavor when you drink it is coffee, I would say that's probably a stout. And if it's something closer to chocolate, I would say it's more likely to be a porter. Now, say everything is like neck and neck, very similar. You really don't know. It's just a dark ale. It's a porter stout or a stout porter. Then I would say ABV is the last thing that you can look at. And yeah, I think that really does it for what you need to think about As always, thanks for tuning in and watching, and please subscribe if you're interested to see more content. I'm going to be trying to do some more of these primer type videos where I get into things, and I'm going to link all the sources that I used in doing my research in the in the information section below, just so you guys can look for yourself and see what the same things I was reading are. Thanks again for tuning in. Take care.